Okay guys, I thought it might be useful to give you a talk through, if you like, a dissertation submission checklist. Every year in the School of Business, obviously we receive a couple of hundred dissertations, and some of those contain the same mistakes, silly mistakes that students make, which are avoidable if you take sufficient care. So the purpose of this presentation is really to talk you through each of the sections within your dissertation, what you should be aiming to include in it, and the mistakes or pitfalls that you should be trying to avoid. I should say at this stage that the checklist is not a guarantee of a high grade. If anything, these are the minimum requirements that we would expect to see in a submission. So don't think that just because you tick all the boxes in relation to the checklist that guarantees you a high grade. It doesn't. However, it does mean that you are certainly on the right path. So let's begin. Obviously, your dissertation will begin with an introduction section. You may decide in advance of that to have an abstract, which is an overview or an executive summary of your work, usually 1 page in duration, which sets out what your study is about, what it intends to achieve, how you went about it, and some of the key findings. But really the introduction is where we start to get into the meat and veg of the dissertation proper. So here it's very important that you state clearly the problem or issue which is to be addressed. Again, from an examiner's perspective, we really want to see if you stated why your research is worthy of study. What is it about this particular topic or phenomena that makes it worthy of consideration? Why is it important? And then have you given your research problem context? Have you said what has been done previously or why this is an important area of study? So other research has pointed to this, there has been a gap, it has never been looked at from this angle, or it has never been done amongst this particular sample. So again, give your readers some idea of the context in which your research is placed. It's not the literature review, it's really more of an overview of why this is worthy of consideration. Have you given some indication of the key literature, identifying any gaps which your research hopes to address? Again, very much speaking to this idea that it's not your literature review, but there's a very sound basis upon which you've decided to look at this particular topic. So you've found a gap, and your research is going to, in some way or partially, address this gap. Have you provided an overview of the structure of the research project? Again, sometimes students are worried that, a bit like EastEnders, that they'll give away the plot before you get to the end of the episode. That's not the case with a dissertation submission. You shouldn't be afraid to repeat yourself, and particularly in the introduction section, it's no harm to tell the reader the journey that you're going to take them on. So what are the various chapters, what will be contained in those chapters, and so give the examiner the opportunity to understand where we're going to go on this journey and what material we're likely to cover. And then a key question to ask yourself is, are there any references in your introduction? There actually should be. Sometimes students think that it's a bad sign if there are references there. It's actually the opposite. You'll be penalised if you don't have some academic references in your introduction section. So moving on, we move to one of the most important sections in terms of marks and marks allocation, and that's the literature review. And really in your literature review, you're trying to demonstrate that by looking at the literature in your area, that you have uncovered the key themes, the major arguments, the various theorists who are most important to this subject matter. And having considered those, that you've arrived at a certain position. So again, is there evidence of up-to-date material pertaining to your area of study? Up-to-date material generally tends to come from journals rather than books. So again, when you're looking at the material in your literature review, is it mainly journal-based? It really should be. Have you provided a synthesis, not a summary of previous studies or research? So again, a common flaw that students often make is to summarize what other people have said without ever relating it back to the research question at hand. So they'll summarize what Darcy 2014 has said, but not explain why that's relevant to their particular research question. So again, don't be afraid to provide, insights into what others have claimed or said, and then to say whether or not you agree with it or how it might impact upon your actual research. Does each paragraph describe simply what somebody else has said? I.e., does it only contain one reference, albeit multiple times, to the same piece of work? Again, this is a bit of a giveaway from an examiner's point of view. If we find a page in your dissertation where there are multiple paragraphs and the same person is referenced down throughout it, it generally tends to smack of a summary, i.e. that particular student has read one piece of work and then has set about summarising it and then moved to another piece of work and summarised it. So you end up with this very obvious paragraph after paragraph referencing the same individual and then moving to the next article or journal that they've read. Really what you're trying to do is integrate those arguments. So in some way take a themed approach. We've spoken about this before, but looking for common themes and seeing what different authors have said about different topics. Again, does your literature have a logical flow? Does it jump from one section to another without any links? And again, depending on what a student has read, you often can see this. They read one article which talks about work-life balance from the perspective of the working mother, and then it jumps very quickly to another article which might be about work-life balance backlash, without ever providing any link between the two. So how are they related? How do they link, and how do they link to the research question at hand? So be careful that you're always aware of how does this section flow into the next section, because at the end of the day you're trying to tell a story. There has to be a start and a finish and a logical flow between the two. Does your literature review have a conclusion? It sounds like your conclusion comes at the very end, but that's not the case. At the end of this section in particular, it's quite important that you highlight for the reader or the examiner what were the key pieces of research that you have based your research question on, why these are important, or any real definitions or meanings that you think might be important later on. So again, particularly if you've quite a large literature review section, try to summarize it in a meaningful way to remind the reader what was important in terms of what they've just seen. Again, at this stage, hopefully you realize that your research question should really be derived or evolving from your literature review. So again, sometimes students struggle with this part. So check, do you have a clearly stated research question or hypotheses? Have you identified and explained the aims and objective of your study? And are you sure that in doing so, that you have met or addressed these? Again, we're talking about a checklist at the end of the process, so make sure you go back and revisit this. Often students submit their aims and objectives, which were their aims and objectives at proposal stage. It's likely that these have evolved and changed, so make sure you go back and that you've adequately stated and addressed each one of these. In terms of methodology, again, it tends to be one of the weakest sections that we see from students. And again, it's an area where you can pick up a lot of marks, but equally do it badly, you'll lose a lot of marks. So think about your methodological approach, and really here all you're trying or asked to do is explain exactly what you have done and why you have gone about it in the way that you have. So the danger points to look for really are as follows. Have you provided summaries of each possible research method without ever linking it to your own work? If so, you really need to revisit this. The classic here is a summary of the chapter in Saunders and Saunders, where students summarize each of the different approaches, quantitative, qualitative, interviews, surveys, questionnaires, focus groups, you name it. Everything is described and summarized, but never actually related to the research question in hand. So there's no need for you to go through each and every single possibility that's available in terms of a methodological approach. Really what you should be putting in here is what you did and those other alternatives that you considered and why you decided to go with the one that you did, why it was appropriate for your research question. This section should really describe, therefore, how the problem was investigated and why the particular methods and techniques you used were employed. Make sure that you do this. It's not rocket science. We really just want a description of what you did and why you did it. Again, the best way to defend your choice of methodology is really to try to point or to justify it by reference to previous research. So again, look at all the literature that you have reviewed as part of your literature review. See what those other studies have done and the approach that they have taken. And if you can, link your methodological approach to what has been done previously. Simple things like, have you provided details of your sample? So who did you ask and why these and not others? The reality is that most of the work that we see is based on convenience sampling or opportunistic sampling, whereby it's through who you know or people that you could get access to. This is completely acceptable, but make sure that you explain the categories that you targeted and why you went after those. Again, what did you ask them? Details about the research instrument. So what did you use to gather your data? Was it a questionnaire? In which case, what were the items or the scales that you used in your questionnaire? If it was interviews, were they semi-structured? In which case, what were the themes that you probed with your interviewees? All of that detail must be described in your methodology section. So again, how you ask them, details about your data collection. And again, sometimes students are reluctant to talk about what happened, particularly if it hasn't gone well. So the classic example is a student who did an interview that was very short because the person they were interviewing was quite rushed, was under pressure, the phone kept ringing. All those details, particularly from a qualitative perspective, are important and should be included in your writing up. Maybe not in your methodology section, but they should certainly be included in terms of your analysis. I would also say that the details about your data collection tend to be quite weak, so make sure you give it adequate consideration. Students often don't tell us what they did with the data that they collected, so data analysis. This isn't to be confused with the later section where you talk about what you found. This is more how you treated the data. So again, this is what you did with it. So I undertook a questionnaire. I surveyed 300 people, 150 people responded. With those responses, I entered them into SPSS and performed certain statistical analysis on them. Or I undertook semi-structured interviews, and on the basis of that, I recorded the information on a certain phone. I played it back, transcribed it, and then undertook content analysis, for example. So again, just how you treated the data and what you did with it. That's very important, and it's important to include it in your methodology section. If you had a pilot study, make sure you mention it and make sure you mention what you did as a result of the pilot. So if there were changes, tell the examiner what changes you made and why. And again, try to include a section on ethical considerations. It's very important. It featured in your proposal stage, but it's important that you have a section here as well. It doesn't have to be particularly long, but you must at least reference the fact that you had some thought towards the ethics of what you were undertaking. And finally, there's some debate about whether or not it should be included here or not. Again, be guided by your supervisor, but it is appropriate should you choose to have a limitation section here, particularly in terms of your methodology. So were there issues in terms of sampling bias, non-response bias, all of those types of issues in terms of I had initially intended to interview 25 individuals, but unfortunately 20 of those refused me at the last stage and I was left with 4. Obviously a sample of 4 is not sufficient and you want to acknowledge and recognize that. So again, the limitations section here is really around the methodology. And again, with limitations of time and resources, certain things do go wrong, and it's quite okay for you to admit to what went wrong and to acknowledge that ideally you might have had a larger sample and how you might go about getting a larger sample if you were to do it again. But most importantly, to acknowledge, well, now that this has happened, now that I have a small sample, this is what must be borne in mind, i.e. let the examiner know that you understand that with this very small sample, it's not possible to draw generalizations, for example. The next section generally tends to be your results or your findings. So again, does your findings section simply list the answer to each question in your questionnaire or interview one after the other? If so, you need to revisit. Help the examiner understand what this means. Help them interpret, I suppose, what this might mean. Is there a logical flow to your findings? And again, from a reader's perspective, have you highlighted the key findings for the reader? So while you may have asked a lot of questions, which were the most important ones, or which were the ones that were most interesting? The discussion section is really where you're bringing together a lot of the material. So again, you're trying to link the findings that you got from your analysis back to the existing literature. So what have we learned that's new? Can you confirm that your findings are consistent with previous research, or are they different? If they're different, why are they different? Can you offer possible explanations for these differences? Is it that previous research was carried out in the US, and in your case you carried it out in Ireland? Is that to say that maybe Irish employees have a different perspective to this particular phenomena than their US counterparts? Again, you're not going to be able to say with definitively why this might be the case, but you can certainly offer possible suggestions. Again, have you highlighted for the reader what was important in your findings? You know, students are often reluctant to pull out the key things, the big things. This was surprising, or this was good, or this was confirmed. You know, be bold and proud about what you find, and don't leave it to the reader to try to sift through everything to find what was meaningful. Are there practical implications arising from your research? If so, say what they might be. If your study, for example, was around stress in the workplace, well, what are the practical implications arising from your findings? What should organisations look to do? What should employees seek to have access to? How can we ensure that stress is at least minimised within the workplace? And again, some consideration around the limitations of your study. Here, maybe not so much the methodology per se, but more general limitations around issues in terms of this study needs to be expanded, or we need to look to a larger sample size in order to check if these findings stand up. But it would appear from this limited study or this initial phase of research that it might be true. Finally, your conclusion section. Here students seem to run out of puff, as we say. It tends to kind of just die a death by the time they get to this stage, and it really shouldn't. Please try and leave adequate time to address your conclusion section properly. I've said here that if your conclusion section is less than 1 page in length, you really do need to visit it. And it's amazing how many dissertations we receive which are 20,000 odd words long and then have less than a page as a conclusion. That's not doing your work justice. So again, back to my EastEnders analogy, don't be afraid to repeat what you've said before. Go back over your approach, go back over your findings, and again tell the reader, remind the reader once more why what you've done is good, why it's a robust piece of research, why what you found is actually interesting and important. And again, don't be afraid to say what the next steps are, what the future research possibilities might be. This is a minor dissertation, so your sample size might be small, fine. So you didn't get to interview as many people as you would like, fine. You know, you didn't get to do both public and private sector, you only got to do one. You only got to look at one aspect of marketing while there are a number of others, fine. Point to what people might do in the future to expand this particular research or to gain greater insight into this particular phenomenon. In doing so, you can help future students, but it also allows the examiner to see that you've thought through your findings and that you're actually interested in future potential and possibility. The reference list is such an important part of your dissertation submission. Those of you who've heard me speak on this before will know that it tends to be the first place that I go as an examiner, because by looking at somebody's reference list, I can get a very quick sense, A, do they know what they're about in terms of formatting and referencing? But B, I also get a sense of the material that they've been reading, so I can very quickly see whether or not you've been reading up-to-date material and where you've been accessing that material, i.e. has it been coming from journals, or is it mainly coming from textbooks, or dare I say internet media quasi-media sources. So again, the reference list, it's really important that you have a good, strong, robust reference list. Make sure you include all references cited in your work. Again, some examiners, including myself, will randomly select in the main body of your work different references to check to see if they're in the reference list and vice versa. I personally, if I find an inconsistency, it causes me to pause for thought and to double check against a number of others. And usually when you find one or two missing, you can be sure there are more. In that case, you tend to start to lose quite significant marks. Again, we've said it a million times, and yet at the end of the program, some people still haven't mastered the art of Harvard referencing. If you're not sure, make sure you consult the vast amount of resources that are available in the library, both in terms of on the portal webpage for the library, but also through the information officer down there, Keith Brittle. Make an appointment, go and see him and ask him to have a look at your referencing if you're concerned. Again, in your reference list, make sure you include all references in alphabetical order by surname. Surname. It's so important. And again, often we find students still at this stage using the initial and putting them in order of the first initial. Don't do that. Again, another don't separate books from journals or journals from media sources or newspapers or any other. All references are in the one list. They're contained in that one list going from A to Z, irrespective of where they're found. So all reference materials should appear in alphabetical order, irrespective of whether it's a book or a journal or working paper. Again, have you included material that is not directly referenced in your research report? If so, revisit. If you have consulted a book which has informed your views but you haven't directly referenced, it should go in your bibliography. Again, there are questions over whether or not you need a bibliography. I would be of the view that you don't, unless you have or you feel that you have relied on this and therefore you'd like to include it. But the rule is, unless you actually reference it in the main body of your work, it should not appear in your reference list. It can go into a bibliography. Which brings us to in-text referencing. Have you ensured that all in-text references appear in your reference list? Again, just checking backwards and forwards. Often students get to the end of their dissertation and underestimate how much time it will take them to sort their references out. Again, we could lecture you in terms of you should have used a bibliographical manager, or even in most Word processing applications now, there is the ability to track your references. But again, don't underestimate the fact that you will go through your dissertation and realize that you're missing a reference. And this can be quite time consuming trying to track it down. So allow some additional time to sort out your referencing at the end. Again, have you used the Harvard method, surname, year approach or date approach? Have you put the full stop after the closed bracket for in-text references? See this example that I have on the slide here. The full stop comes at the end of Darcy 2013, close bracket, full stop. It doesn't come before it. It's amazing how many students still persist in doing it, and it's probably no harm to revisit that short slide presentation that I've put up for you in terms of the top 5 mistakes with regard to referencing. Again, just something to watch out for. Have you included an author's initial in your in-text referencing? If so, please revisit. This is a general rule. There is a more specific rule where it might be appropriate, but in the main, it's just safe enough to say that you should not have initials besides somebody's in-text reference. So again, it's surname and the year. So Darcy 2013. So finally, some housekeeping issues. Make sure that you perform a spelling and grammar check on your work prior to submission. It's amazing how many students submit their work with spelling mistakes or spelling errors, particularly around key terms that they're actually using in their research. There's no reason for that now, given that word processors have this capability and it's easily done. Are there unexplained gaps between sections of your work or blank pages where the work begins halfway down the sheet? Again, if so, please revisit. We've all been in the situation where what appears on the screen is different in terms of what's printed out. Again, your work comes across as quite sloppy. if that happens to you. So again, take care to make sure that your work is tidy with a professional presentation. There are marks for it, and it's important that you should do it. At the end of the day, your dissertation will go on display in the library. Others will see it for years to come, and therefore it's important that it looks the part. So overall, I guess what I'm saying to you is there are certain key things that you must include in your dissertation submission. There are equally a number of pitfalls that it would be a good idea, if possible, to try to avoid. Your supervisor is there to guide you, but it's important that you take responsibility for your own work and make sure that you work through this checklist in order to satisfy yourself and potentially your examiner that you've addressed these issues. I've made a copy of this checklist available in Word format, so again, if you wish, you can demonstrate to your examiner by ticking each of the sections that you've addressed. You might want to put this in loose inside the cover of your submission. I don't think it needs to be bound into the actual submission document itself, but I think it is nice for an examiner to see, well, at least this student has attempted to address these issues, and therefore I know when I come to look at their work that I won't have to worry about these. If nothing else, it starts the examiner thinking about a higher grade, and surely that's what everyone's after. Again, I wish you luck with your submissions, and I look forward to reading them in the very near future. Thank you.